Good morning, everyone. Well, it's the morning of New Year's Eve in Munich. And I'm going to finish 2020 by finishing the body of this sweater. If you have been watching before, you will notice, first of all, that my hands are doing something slightly different. I am now doing ribbing around the bottom of the body. So I've been trying it on, and finally last night I decided it was long enough. I did do the thing we mentioned where I measured exactly how much was left on my ball of wool and how much yarn I used for a single round of the body to work out how many I could do. I had about 9 rows left on that ball. So I have joined in the new ball. So I'm on my last ball of wool, but I'm going to do the short sleeve. So it should be enough. And so I'm now just finishing the ribbing at the bottom of the waist. So ribbing is where you're going to be alternating knits and purls. So on this pattern, which is Lenatus by Susan Crawford, I'm doing a 2x2 rib at the waistband. So if I show you the collar, this matches what we did on the collar. So if I go back up to the collar here at the top. So the collar there, that is a 2x2 rib. So you can see there's sort of columns of stitches. So there's a column of 2 knit stitches and then 2 purls. And ribbing is actually reversible. It looks the same on both sides because from a reverse a knit is a purl and vice versa. So I'm actually going to be duplicating this at the waistline, meant to be about 1 centimeter's worth, which is what I had at the neck. And I should probably count those stitches actually, just so I make sure. It's not like people are going to be able to tell, but just so I know exactly what I had before. And this is better lighting for me to actually count. So I'm actually going to count them. Hang on a second. Oh, where's my, start at the top. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, about 9 or 10 rows, of ribbing. So I've actually switched back to a smaller needle, smaller both in terms of length because it's a fixed circular, it's not an interchangeable like I was using before, but I've gone back down to the smallest size, the size that I used on the neck, which was a 2.75 millimeter. I mean, the one that I was using on the body stitches itself was a 3.75. So it, as you can see, was a fair bit bigger than the one I'm knitting with now. And the reason you often use a smaller needle for ribbing is because ribbing, the process of doing those knits and purls together in a row, it creates elasticity. That's why ribbing it's stretchy. And so you often use a smaller needle because that helps sort of maximize that elasticity. And if you did it on a big needle, it would just be a bit more floppy. It wouldn't pull in. And so we often use this for cuffs and collars. And so the pattern will usually tell you to use a smaller needle on the ribbing to give you a little bit more elasticity. So just doing, we'll do 1 knit. 2. So this is a 2x2 ribbing. Ribbing actually comes in different varieties. You can do 1x1, 1 knit, 1 purl. That's a 1x1. 2x2 was what I'm doing. 2 knits, 2 purls. You can do 3x3, 4x4. You can mix the numbers up, 4x2, whatever. Generally, the bigger the number, the more elasticity you get because those purl stitches kind of recede and the knit come in. So like if you're doing all over like a fisherman's rib sweater, it will generally be like bigger knit columns. But I'm doing 2x2. So I've just done 2 knits and so this is something that catches a lot of beginners up. And so I'm going to show you this because I've mainly been knitting so far on these episodes that you've seen me. But this is the first time I'm really purling. Okay, so I'm going to do 2 knits. So just as we've been doing, I'm going to let me get centered here. Needle in, around, knit, and off. So again, 4 steps. In, around, pull the stitch through, and off. Now I'm going to switch to purl. And so when you purl, we often talk about this concept of yarn in front or yarn in back. And that confuses a lot of new knitters. Yarn in front means the yarn on the side of the work closest to you. So this side versus this side of the needle is the back. The back is the side that's away from me. So you can see right now my working yarn is in the back when you're knitting. It's coming off the back side of the needle, and that's where it stays. But when you purl, you actually need the working yarn in the front. So one thing some knitters do is they go to make their purl stitch where you put the needle in and then you go to put the needle around, and they just leave the yarn in the back. And so when you make the stitch, what happens is you actually create an extra loop on the needle. Can you see that? I've got that extra little loop there in the middle. And that's a mistake. It's a yarn over. It's going to create a hole in our knitting. It's also creating an extra stitch, which means when we come back around to it, we've suddenly got an extra stitch there. So if you've ever tried doing ribbing as a new knitter, switching from a knit to a purl, and suddenly found your piece getting wider, or found that you've got extra stitches, or found that your knitting has holes in it, this is probably why. So if I undo this, so the way you properly do it, so I've just finished that knit stitch, is I'm actually going to move the yarn to the front of the work. And all that means is I take this working yarn, I'm just going to move it between the needles. So it's coming out of the front now. So literally, I'm just moving it between the tips. So if I open it up, you can tell. So I'm actually just moving it between the two tips to the front. And now it's at the front where I need it to be for purling. So to purl, we're going from the right side of the stitch. So there's our stitch. We're going from the right side back sort of towards me. I always think of it as sort of stabbing towards me. So instead of in knitting, we go from the left side and away. In purling, we go from the right side and towards. The working yarn goes around the needle from the top first and around to the left. And then again, I'm using my thumb to kind of push that needle tip back out with the loop and then off. And that's it. That's a purl. I don't know. People think purl is somehow like difficult. It's just the inverse of knitting. So again, from the right side towards you, around the top and over to the left to make the stitch. And again, this is me being a thrower. So remember holding the working wool in my right-hand side. I push the tip back out with my thumb to make the loop and then off. That's my two purls. Now I'm ready to knit. So again, my working wool is at the front of the yarn. I need it in the back. So I'm just going to move it between the two tips. And so now it's where I need it for my two knit stitches. See, that's this extra movement I'm doing every two stitches is I'm moving the yarn from the front to the back. Move it to front to back. And often, you'll see often what I do is I give it a little bit of a tug before I do that. I guess because, again, I'm trying to make my ribbing fairly elastic and a bit tighter. And I'm not yanking it hard, but I'm just sort of pulling out the slack, because if you don't and you just take it from the front to the back, I feel like it just gets a little bit of floppy. You leave a little bit of extra sort of yarn in there. So I tend to give it just a gentle tug before I swap from the front to the back. It's kind of part of the same movement. And so as I said, for these purls, I am a thrower, so I'm holding the working wool in my right hand. You can purl continental style with the wool in your left hand. I'm not good at it. It's awkward. And in fact, I'm not even really sure how to do it. The way that I do it when I do my color work where I need to do it is, let me do my two knit stitches. So two knit. And then I'm ready to purl. The way I've seen it done, and I did this on an earlier episode, there is a way they do it in South America where you actually drape the yarn around your neck. So if you look in the little picture, I'm actually draping it around my neck now. And you see now I'm not holding it. It's sort of hanging taut off my neck. And so now if I put the needle in for the purl, I'm just going to sort of twang that yarn over the needle, whoops, like that, and make my stitch and off. So again, twang it and off. So that's one way you can do purls, continental style. I mean, basically, you're not even touching the yarn. You're using you're draping it around your neck to give it the tension. And so when I do Fair Isle in flat, I need to do two colors. That's how I'll do the purl side. There are other ways to do it, but I don't know how. So if you're a continental knitter, I'm sure there's a gazillion videos on YouTube. Please look it up. But you're seeing me do it. English thrower style. So ribbing does, because you are switching back and forth and you're moving the needles back and forth, it is a little bit slower for me than plain knitting. But if I spread it out, you can start to see the ribbing taking shape there along the needle. this is a good point to talk about how you read your knitting, because let's say you finish at the end of the night, like I did last night, you set this down, you pick it up, you need to know if you're on a knit or a purl. And that can be hard if you're starting out. And that's really where you just need to be able to look at your knitting and tell on the needle. And it just requires some practice. So I'll see how good a resolution we can get here. If I hold this up that way to the needle, and you look at this next stitch on the left, the one I'm about to knit, you can see it comes off the needle. It's just a loop on the needle. There's no bump at the bottom of it. Versus if you look at let me spread them out a little bit. If you look at the third stitch, see it has a little bump at the bottom? I can point to it. That little bump right there versus these first two do not. These first two are knits. The next two have a bump, a crossbar at the bottom of it. You know, I'm sort of pointing to it right there. That crossbar is a purl. That's literally how you tell. You look for a bump at the bottom of the stitch. If there is a bump, it's a purl. If there's not, if it's a V, it's a knit. So the stitches I've just knitted, or purled rather, have bumps at the bottom of them. And I'm ready for the knits. Knit, knit. And obviously with doing 2x2 rib, I needed a multiple of 4 stitches. And hilariously, when I started my ribbing last night, I ended up with 1 extra stitch. So I went around going 2x2, I did 2 knits, and then I had 3 stitches left to end the row. Like crap. So obviously at some point in this great expanse of body knitting, I've created a stitch. And you know what? I decided I was fine with that. Not worth going back and trying to find it. No one will ever see it. So instead, I just, on the final purl stitch, purled 2 together to get rid of it. You know, that's the kind of thing that I think earlier in my knitting career would have driven me a bit crazy, trying to figure out where I'd created the stitch. Now I'm like, look, there's no loose stitches. It's not going to unravel. Obviously, there's a tiny hole somewhere I created a yarn over, or I split a stitch, or maybe it was when I joined in a ball of wool and I knitted some stitches, 2 strands together, and then when I came back to them, I treated them as separate instead of as 1 stitch. I don't know. Somehow I created a stitch. It's cool. I got rid of it. And of course, I'm wearing a different hand knitted jumper for you today. I don't know if you can see this one. This was another Fair Isle jumper that I did many years ago. The one that I'm wearing is called Road to Golden. And it was an interweave pattern, I believe. I saw it in I think a magazine, one of their magazines maybe, and fell in love with the pattern. And I'll show you what it looked like in the pattern book. Oh no, that's mine. Sorry, that's mine. Here's what it looked like in the pattern book. And it's an interesting, I fell in love with the color work of it because it's Fair Isle, but it's not fine Fair Isle. It's using 8-ply double knitting or light worsted weight wool. So it knits up, you can see the resolution, the pixels in that color work are bigger than what I've done on this particular jumper on Lenatus. And so I sort of fell in love with it. It was called, as I said, called Road to Golden, if you want to look it up on Ravelry. But the particular wool that the designer used was not available, or I couldn't easily find in Australia. So I went to my local knitting shop. I went to Morris & Sons. Actually, it might have been even when I was working there back in Sydney. And one of the store managers, Leanne, she's awesome. She helped me. She's great with color. Because I didn't have the exact same wool, I couldn't find the exact same colorway. And so what we instead did was try to find a yarn that had enough colors that would provide me sort of similar contrast and give me a similar sort of effect. So we settled on Filatura de Croce Zara, which is honestly one of my favorite wools to knit with. I just love it. And so my version, which you saw a spoiler of, so this is my version. Slightly different. I changed it in several ways. I mean, not just the color. So the neckline is a big one. You know, the original one had like this, I guess, what would you call that? Like a bateau neckline, like a big wide boat neck neckline. And I don't like that. Look, you can see her, she's got like a tank top or bra underneath. I don't want my bra straps hanging out. I want a proper sweater. So I completely changed. And also I'm a taller person. So my depth, like her depth from armpit to shoulder there is not very deep at all. So I brought it up quite a bit. So I've actually done a modified saddle shoulder. So I actually went back and forth on the shoulder a fair bit to eat up some more stitches, which was a technique I got from Elizabeth Zimmerman, to basically raise that neckline up and make it more of a crew neck. I still don't love it. Like, it's still a little bit like cutting across. I wish I'd sort of left the neckline a little lower at the front and higher at the back. That's how I tend to like my jumpers, but it's wearable. It's so cozy. It's not it's not itchy at all, the Zara. It's one of the reasons I love it. And I mean, one of the things I really like about this pattern is that sleeve, the shoulder, because she has to do this really cool checkerboard with each color of the yarn because it's knitted seamless. So you start from the bottom of the body, you knit up to the armpits, you set it aside, you knit the sleeves up to the armpits, and then you get all three going on one needle. So kind of the opposite direction from the one I'm knitting now. And I just love that effect that when you're doing across the shoulders, you don't continue the design, you do this checkerboard, this sort of separate design. And I just think it looks really cool. I almost would just like the whole jumper to be that sort of checkerboard design. I think it looks really neat. And I'm wearing it right now. But it's a nice little jumper. The other thing, I made sure I knitted the sleeves really long. Like I got fed up with sleeves that were too short, and so if anything, they've got really long sleeves. But it's nice. It's a nice jumper to wear. The cuffs, actually, interesting thing, the cuffs and collar of this one are not ribbing. It's one of the unusual jumpers in that it doesn't have ribbing there. If I show you the cuff here, let me switch back to this one. The cuff is actually garter stitch. So you see, it doesn't pull in. It's a reversible cuff. It's the same on both sides. And this is knitting every row. If you're knitting back and forth, and I actually did it because you see it's a split cuff. So you actually start by casting on and knitting back and forth, knitting every row for how many? 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20, 22, 23, for 24 rows or so of garter stitch. And then you join it on a circular needle and start going around and around in stocking stitch. And so it's a different style. It's a different style cuff. I like it, but I thought I would show you a different style jumper. This is because it's 8-ply Fair Isle, it's very warm, which means it did not get a lot of wear in Australia. You know, on the inside, pull up the body a little bit, like on the inside, this, like, that's effectively 2 layers of very thick wool. You know, that's the stranding on the inside, which makes it super warm. So it's definitely a jumper that's going to get more wear in Germany than it did in Australia. Back to ribbing. So I do have there, I did briefly show it, if you missed the last time I did knitting, that was the last size check I did in terms of the body length the other night. I probably went for another inch past that just because it was no longer a crop top, which is good, but I did want it a little bit longer. So it's probably another inch or so longer than you see there. And that's when I then decided to start the waist ribbing. I was really hoping to get done with it on this, get to the cast off on this session, and then pick up the sleeves so you can see how that is going to work. If you have any questions, feel free to pop them in the chat. I spent all of Boxing Day knitting and watching Bridgerton. By the way, the designer of this jumper of Lanata, Susan Crawford, I'm now on her mailing list, and you should actually look her up and join her mailing list because she's so tempting. She sent out an email the other day. She's actually partnered with a wool company in the UK to do kits for a couple of her designs, and they're very tempting, like a full-on kit with the actual wool. So I'm thinking about it. Not every one of the garments is to my style, but several of them are. So I'm back to the knitting after a couple days of sewing. You would have seen my last couple of streams. I was sewing. I sewed another blouse for myself. So I keep getting confused when I start streaming. I have to change it back to say knitting or sewing. Hi, Melissa. So how did the blouse come out then? Oh, the blouse came out great. So I did the pink one. Let me see if I can... this software doesn't really like when I try and switch to a browser, but let me see if I can get you a picture. Or I'll put it in the chat. That's what I'll do. I'll put it in the chat. So I did put the a photo of the finished blouse on my Instagram. But I was doing the Liberty Tanalon, and I had exactly 2 meters, and the pattern really wanted a little more than that. So there's the Instagram where you can see the finished blouse. But I squeaked it out. I just was able to fit the pattern pieces for that ruffle sleeve top out of 2 meters. And that was with, I didn't do the facings. I did bias binding at the neckline. I was like literally cutting pieces out along the selvage edge because I knew that it was going to get folded into a hem or into a seam, and that was the only way I would have enough. I managed to end up with about a 9 or 10 inch scrap square left that I was able to use to make enough bias binding to go around the neckline. But it's very satisfying, I think, when you manage a squeaker is a very satisfying thing, because I was worried I wasn't going to have enough. I am often guilty when I buy fabric, because fabric's expensive, especially nice fabric. I'm often, for some reason, with wool, with yarn, I have less of a problem with overbuying, because you can always use wool for something else. I guess fabric, when I'm buying a garment quantity, I don't know, mentally I try and buy as little as I can get away with, but yeah, that was a squeaker. But I managed it. And I think I've got the ruffle sewing bug out of my system now. I did do a couple slight changes on the pink one. If you watch me make the blue one, I did the shoulder seams, French seams on that one this time, because I knew I wasn't going to do the facing. And I did a broad back adjustment, because on the first one, on the blue one, I noticed that when I pulled my arms forward, it felt a little bit tight across the back. And look, I'm tall and I slouch and I have broad shoulders, so I think my upper shoulder is a bit broader than the pattern most pattern blocks. And so I did a broad back adjustment of about 1 centimeter on each side, and which is about as much as you can get away with without having to then add a dart. And look, it's still not enough. Like, it still feels a little tight, but it's better. So those were the only changes I made on the pink one. That's what he's saying. Yeah, yarn chicken. Yes, exactly. Yarn chicken. Well, look, this is the last ball I have to do this one. So that kind of solves the question of whether I'm doing the long sleeves or the short sleeves. I'm doing the short sleeves. I mean, I could probably get another ball, but I think right now with lockdown, all the shops are closed. It's sadly, the yarn store is not categorized as essential. I don't know if they're doing delivery or not, but I'll go the short sleeve. It'll be fun. I'll go the short sleeve. All right, back to the beginning of the row, move the yarn, the stitch marker, keep going. But yeah, last night I got out my husband has these scales he uses for weighing out his ground coffee shots that are like very, very precise, like basically like drug dealer scales. And I was like, can I use your drug dealer scales to weigh my yarn? He's like, sure. So I measured out, to the 100th of a gram, how much yarn was left on the old ball. And then, so I wrote that down, and then I knitted a body round, and then I weighed it again. So I worked out that each round of the body of this used, what was it? It was like, it was like 0.89, or 8... It was like 0.89 of a gram, was it? Yeah, something like that, 0.89 of a gram. And so I was able to work out how many rounds I had left. And I wanted to go a little bit further before I did the ribbing, which is why I joined the new ball on. But I've played yarn chicken and lost many a time myself. I have socks where the toes are in a different color because I ran out of the yarn. You have a big skein of leftover. Yeah. I mean, the good news is if you have a whole skein, usually a good yarn store will let you exchange that for credit, So that's the one advantage, I guess, to yarn over fabric is you can never return cut fabric. They're not going to take that back. But a full skein of yarn from a knitting shop, usually they will. Yeah, a Michaels. Yeah, I remember back in the U.S. I mean, Michaels carries the big box stuff. It's nice to have a big craft store. Sadly, you don't really get that overseas. In Australia, we had, I guess the equivalent is a Spotlight or a Lincraft. They're all right. I mean, they carry the big name stuff. I got this yarn. This is Artelia. No, the wool is Lana Grossoff, Cool Wool Fine, this merino. But I got it from a little knitting shop in Munich called Artelia, which is very cute. You were on a C2C and ran out at the corner. Ah, yes, that is the really annoying thing, is when you're knitting something. Like if you're knitting a rectangle or a scarf or whatever, it's fine, you just make it shorter. But when you're doing a parallelogram or something that is has shaping at the end. And so I was doing one, not a Clipoti, but it's something similar, something that tapered down to a point with some Noro. And I ended up being short, like, I don't know, enough to do like just the last tiny bit. And so I talked about this in a previous stream. I ended up going back to where all my ends were hanging that I hadn't woven in yet. I wove in the ends, I as short as possible, cut off as much excess as possible, and then laboriously spit felted, and it was spit because I was doing this like at an outdoor all day knit in, and spit felting it all together. And I did squeak out just enough to finish the thing. But yeah, that you don't want to do that. That is a stressful thing to do. Because yeah, when you've got something with a pattern on the corner, the only thing to do is unfrog the whole thing and go back and try and start it earlier. Ugh, who needs that? But yeah, I should have enough to do the short sleeves. I mean, this whole thing used like 5. I mean, the body used basically 4 of the blue. You get quite a bit out of it. And so I think the short sleeves are going to be fine. So you must be in the US, Melissa, I'm guessing, if you've got Michaels. My sister used to work at a Michaels back in Fort Wayne in the framing department when she was in college. Mountains of North Carolina. Oh, cool. Never been to North Carolina. Yeah, it's really frustrating when you have to wait for the yarn. Or, and I talked about this before, like the dye lots, because, the non-knitting muggles, they don't necessarily know this, that, when you buy wool and they dye it in these giant batches. Do I have one of the labels up here? I do. They buy it they dye it in batches, and they number the batches. So you can see here the color and the dye lot. And so you really need to make sure when you go buy it that all the dye lot is the same, or else you will notice it. You will notice it across, especially across an expanse of the body like this one. Oh, you crochet. Oh, I'm impressed. I mean, I have crocheted a couple things. I crocheted a sort of a throw to go on the back of the couch. And I've done a couple classes, like I've done a class on Tunisian crochet. But crochet, for some reason, does not stick in my brain. It's like every time I do it, I have to completely relearn it again from scratch. For some reason, and I talk about this, I've given a talk at several tech conferences about how knitting is like computer programming. But I often start off by talking about what the difference is between knitting and crochet. And, crochet can go off in it's very three-dimensional, very sculptural. Here's a tip for anyone watching who doesn't know. And I happen to have one handy. With crochet, you use a hook. This is a hook. You just use a single hook. Notice the difference in what I'm doing. That's 2 needles. Very different. And so when you're doing crochet, you can go off in any direction at any time. It's great for making soft toys, sort of sculptural pieces. There's a fantastic project that travels around the world called the crocheted coral reef. Hyperbolic crocheted coral reef, because because of the way you can crochet circular shapes, you can actually crochet like 4-dimensional things, like I said, hyperbolic curves and things like that. And so it's very mathematical. You can illustrate some very interesting mathematical concepts with crochet. Yes, you can also use it to make garments. Crochet fabric tends to be a bit chunkier than knitted fabric. So you don't see it used a lot for garments for that reason, because it is a bit chunkier, and so not a lot of designers are great at figuring out how to turn that into something people want to wear. I have seen some, like that's one great thing about the Sydney Royal Easter Show in recent years. I will admit the quality of the crochet stuff has gone massively up, and there's stuff that actually tempts me. Yes, I will eventually do amigurumi. Yeah, amigurumi that's the doing the soft toys. Amigurumi is the Japanese stuff, where you make these very cute little characters and there's books on it. One of the things I love about crochet, by the way, is you can actually buy crochet. Crochet uses, yes, you can write out patterns in words, but one of the headaches of crochet, and I learned this being an American Australian working in a yarn shop in Australia, is that the crochet patterns in the US will use the exact same terms as in the UK and Australia, but mean different things. A double crochet in the US is not a double crochet in the UK. They use the same terms to mean different things, which is terribly confusing. So if you are going to do a crochet pattern, you have to actually know what the different abbreviations mean. With a knitting pattern, a K is a knit, a P is a purl. An SSK is always done the same way, regardless, which is less ambiguous than in crochet. So that's one area where crochet has a little bit of ambiguity when you're doing a pattern. But on the flip side, crochet actually has a universal graphical language for expressing patterns. And I've seen it more and more in some of the books, especially the Japanese crochet books, where you can actually draw little symbols for each of the and symbols are unambiguous. You know, a symbol can only mean one thing. And so there's a great Japanese bookstore called Kinokuniya that has an outlet in Sydney. And you can actually buy crochet books from there in Japanese, not reading a word of Japanese, but if you know that symbol language, you can go ahead and crochet anything in the book, which I always found really cool. You know, using a graphical language like that, like symbols, it's less ambiguous. It often takes up less space than writing it out in words. It's nice because it looks like the thing that you're crocheting, so you get some sort of visual checking as you're going that it's looking correct. There apparently is a knitting version of that. There is some attempt in a knitting version, but look, knitting charts, everybody uses different, you know, some symbols are widely used, but as far as I know, there is no standard that has taken off the way there has been in the crochet world. But yeah, I just find crochet, I feel like crochet uses like the other side of the brain. Like, and for me, knitting and to an extent, sewing and patchwork, I think very much in repeating patterns and in flat two-dimensional, and then you know, using that to construct something three-dimensional. The idea of being able to, like, I mean, crochet is like 3D printing, man. You can just 3D, you know, it's real life 3D printing, and I just find it, my brain struggles with it sometimes. Like I said, I've done some classes. Tunisian crochet is really fun. That's where you do crochet, but the hook is really long. Like instead, look, this is a short one, but you can have a hook that's like 12 inches or 16 inches, or even turns into a circular needle like mine, where it has, you know, like a meter if you're going to do a blanket. So Tunisian crochet is kind of cool. It's almost like a hybrid between knitting and crochet. But yeah, I've done like a throw, as you said, Melissa. Like, yeah, crochet blankets, they're a little heavy. It's actually one of the things I like about them, though. Like, I think we had a crochet blanket on the couch in the 70s when I was growing up. And so that's what I associate it with, you know. My mom made one out of a popcorn stitch. And so that's actually still on my bucket list. My one thing I want to crochet is a popcorn stitch blanket. And one of these days I will. Almost looks like an egg crate, you know. It's got that sort of up and down kind of popcorn quality. I thought we would get to the casting off and the casting on the sleeves. It's taking a little longer. Forgot how long these body rows are. They're hundreds of stitches. So I finished Bridgerton, knitting the body. And then last night I binged most of Broadchurch, which for some reason I hadn't actually watched yet. I knew it was supposed to be good. It's years old at this point, season 1 of Broadchurch. And I'm up to the last 2 episodes, so nobody spoil it. But that's what I will be knitting and watching. Yeah, it's a lot of counting, but you don't actually have to count. Like for the body, you know, you're just knitting for the most of it. And then, as I said, doing the setting up the ribbing and doing the knits and purls. Somehow I ended up 1 stitch off. That's okay. But yeah, you don't actually have to count through the body of this. And I didn't bother counting rows because it's top down. You just try it on as you go. You binge I haven't seen, that's the other thing I need to do. I need to do season 2 of The Mandalorian. So I've only got 4 days left of vacation before back to work on Monday. So I need to finish the last 2 of Broadchurch. And then I need to sign up for Disney Plus again because I let it lapse when we moved countries. And yeah, then I need to watch season 2 of The Mandalorian. although I'm totally spoiled because everybody on the internet couldn't shut up about it the minute it aired, but I'll watch it anyway. Out of curiosity, Melissa, how did you find my stream? Was it just random, or do you follow me somewhere else? Just because I'm still new to this and I have no idea how people actually find you on Twitch. I mean, random. Oh, cool. Thanks. Well, that's cool. I mean, I think the first few I did were mainly family and friends. And it's interesting because, I'm from Australia, my family are in the US, and I'm living in Germany. So I'm kind of split the difference. And so sometimes I'm knitting in the morning, like now, which is better you're late at night in the US, aren't you? You're up quite late, I think. Normally I do a stream later in the day from folks in the US. I tend to think when I do it in the morning in Germany, I get the folks in Australia more. I want music. I need to figure out. I saw that Twitch have this soundtrack thing. You can play music in the background, but it's only for Windows. So I need to figure out a solution so I can have some music going. And then I don't have to talk so much. Got up at 3 a.m. Oof. Oh, you poor thing. The cat got me up. Well, I'm glad you're here anyway. I have a cat. But he is back in Sydney. We didn't bring him to Germany. He's living with my friend who is renting our house. She is caring for him. I miss him a lot, but he's an anxious fellow. He would not have enjoyed. I think he would actually like our house, and it would be so lovely to have him here with us. But I don't think 24 hours of flying on two different airlines, it would have really traumatized him. So instead, I get lots of pictures of him snuggled up back in his house, and I miss him terribly. But I think it was the best thing for him, and he will be there when we go back in a couple years. Hopefully the little piece of crap remembers us. Corner to corner camo striped blanket. Oh, interesting. I actually have a quilt, an actual quilt, sewn quilt that I started several years ago that's been sitting, which that's actually probably the next thing I'll pick up. I started like 3 or 4 years ago, but it's a t-shirt quilt. Because, I had all these t-shirts from like college and from concerts and things, and some of them were getting very old and on the verge of falling apart. And my mom runs a quilting shop back in Indiana. And I think it was through her I learned about this concept of a t-shirt quilt. Oh, who's messaging me? Oh, a couple of my friends back in Australia. And so I actually cut them up. I cut up the shirts, and I've sewn them together into a quilt. I backed them with interfacing, and I've sewn together into a quilt top. And I was actually doing a bit of embroidery because there's a couple of blank squares. So I'm doing some embroidery on the blank squares. And then I just need to actually put the sucker together and quilt it. And it's just too hot to do that most of the year in Australia. So it seems like a good thing to do here. And it's been sitting in the work in progress pile for a really long time. So I should work on that. Oh, you've got 2 cats. Yeah. Oh, Tabby and a calico. We had another cat, a calico, Dr. Amy, and she passed away in May when we were in lockdown. April, May. Those months all kind of blur together, to be honest with you. She was 16, and it came very suddenly, and I was just thinking about her last night. I did that thing on Instagram, where you do your top 9, and one of my top 9 was a photo of her. I actually printed that photo out really, really big before we left, so I need to find a framer here and get it framed, because she was such a gorgeous, she's a very gorgeous tortoiseshell and calico. Or she was calico, which they call torty and white in Australia, because they don't have, for some reason, call them calico, but she was calico. Yeah, this yarn is so soft. It really is. It's, like I said, it's 100% merino, but the way it's spun, it's just not itchy in the slightest. It's going to be really nice to wear. And how many rows have I done? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So I need to do at least 2 or 3 more before I cast it off. Oh, I'm so sorry. You lost yours at Golden Boy. Oh. Yeah, we got her when she was, 3 months old, and we had her for 16 years, and we don't have kids. She was, sounds a bit silly, she was our baby. And I hadn't had a pet that died since I was a kid, And even then, I think our dog, he died when I was away at college and stuff. So it was the first one that I was kind of there and present for. And she'd been ailing in her last year or two. We could tell she had arthritis. She wasn't doing as well. And we kind of had some early discussions about, all right, what's our plan? Hang on, is that a knit or a purl? Let me just go back one. Should be a knit. Yeah. And so we'd had some discussions, and then we were trying to figure out, because the move to Germany was on the table, and what we were going to do with her, whether we would bring her with us. It would be I'd actually talked to a few folks about whether they'd be interested in sort of, effectively fostering her, people with experience for, cats. But she kind of forced the issue. We noticed one day she didn't eat, and our girl loved her food. She always ate, and she had a full 24 hours where we realized she hadn't eaten anything, and then we noticed she was panting, which in cats is a very bad sign. And so we actually took her to in the time of Corona, we took her to the 24-hour veterinary hospital, and they confirmed she had lots of fluid around her heart, and they think cancer or, as you said, kidney failure, something like that, liver. I think she had elevated liver, something or other. And so they kept her overnight and called us in the morning and said, look, we can send her home with you. There is no guarantee that you won't be back here in a week. And she was not comfortable. And so we made the decision, and we went in and did it. And it really sucked. Oh, you made me all sad. Ah. Also, look at us, 2 women on the knitting channel talking about cats. How cliched are we? But I'm really sorry to hear about your Golden Boy. New Year's Eve. Wow. Okay. What a year. I'm not really sure. I mean, obviously, we're not going anywhere to celebrate. I've been reading the news every day with interest, because it's been interesting, like having left Australia 3 months ago, and then sort of kicking ourselves as Germany, Germany went through the early stages of the pandemic fairly well, and then things have been going badly for the last few months. Numbers have been increasing up as summer ended and went into autumn, and so we now find ourselves in lockdown again. And then I've been looking on with envy at my friends back in Australia, going out to restaurants and not wearing masks and all kinds of stuff. And now, of course, the numbers are going up again. And I've just had a message from my friend. Oh, she literally just sent me a picture of Petey on the couch. Hang on, where is he? Happy New Year from Petey on the couch. Oh, thanks, Cal. Oh, that's good. Yeah, I know it's bad in America, Melissa. It's terrible. Like my family, I have a great aunt in Florida who's in the hospital with COVID. My mother, my stepfather have had it. My aunt has had it. Luckily, my great aunt in Florida, she's the only one who's had to be hospitalized, and so far she seems to be responding well. But man, the U.S. I'm glad I'm not there. I was there in January. I went for a work trip and got to visit my family back then, but haven't been. But normally I would, go back once or twice a year, but I'm not going to be there anytime soon, I fear. I was hoping for a trip in the next summer, but we'll see. Just going to reply to her and thank her for sending that photo. I said, I was just talking about him on my Twitch stream, and then your message came through. Your ears must have been burning. No, not military at all. Melissa's asking, is my family military? No. I grew up back in Indiana. I did a semester in London and really loved it. And so when I graduated, I got a work visa and went back to work in London just because I loved living there so much. And fell in love with an Aussie boy. And so at the end of 2001, we moved to Sydney and eventually got married, and we're in Sydney for about 20 years. And then literally about a year ago, November last year, so we both work in the tech industry. And so I came out to Europe a year ago to speak at a tech conference in Lithuania, Vilnius, Lithuania, and Kiev, Ukraine. And then we had a couple days in Munich at the end just for a holiday. Neither of us had ever been to Munich. And we kind of fell in love with the city. And so honestly, New Year's last year, literally this time last year, we were like thinking about the plans for 2020. And both of us realized, that we had offices, our companies have offices in Munich. And we sort of started joking about, like, wouldn't it be fun to move to Europe for a while? Because, we both met living in Europe, in London, 20 years earlier, and thought, we don't have kids. The timing seems right. Let's go to Europe for a couple years, right? And then 3 months later, after we'd started the process, the pandemic hit. So really, you can blame me for everything, because clearly it was the fact that I made a plan to move overseas and doomed us all. But we still got here in the end. So no, absolutely no connection to Germany other than the fact I did a summer exchange program here in high school, so I speak a little bit of German. But I had never been to Munich, had never been to Bavaria. My husband, as Aussie, had never been to Germany before we visited last year. But he likes beer and sausages and has been learning the language a bit as well. So no, it was purely an adventure, no ties whatsoever. There have been many times in the last few months where I sort of wondered if maybe we were a bit crazy. And, we've had discussions about this, like, do we regret it? Because the reasons we moved here, we moved here thinking, my job at my company, I would be traveling quite a bit all over Europe. And so the idea was that we would see a lot of Europe. We would because we lived here when we were 20, 22 years old. We didn't take advantage of it. We worked 14-hour days. We went to the pub. We hung out with our friends. We didn't travel. We didn't go to amazing museums. We were stupid. And so now it's like, okay, we're grown up. We have money. We know what we like. We're going to travel Europe. We're going to go to amazing restaurants. We're going to see plays. We're going to go to museums. And we cannot do any of it. We have been locked in a house for the last the first few months when we got to Germany, we weren't under lockdown. And so We managed a couple day trips, the best of which, honestly, like a week before lockdown, was we went to the Zugspitze, which is the highest mountain in Germany on the border with Austria in the Alps. And I'm so glad we did. Like, look, it was obviously that's why we ended up going into lockdown, because there were a lot of people there. You know, I rode a cable car up the mountain with like 50 people. Granted, everyone's wearing masks, but still, you could see that people were not necessarily taking it as seriously as they should have, and that probably includes us. But I'm really glad we went, because otherwise we wouldn't have gotten to see anything really of Bavaria. But it'll be a while before we get to travel. I'm really hoping in the next few months things improve. I have a reservation we made 6 months in advance for April 2nd, I think, at Osteria Francescana in Modena, Italy, which is, for a while, was the best restaurant in the world. And we managed to score a booking. And if I'm not able to go, I'm going to cry. I mean, I think we could drive to Modena if we needed to. But obviously it depends on whether the restaurant is open, what the world is going to be like in 3 months. When we packed up our house in Australia, we had the movers come. And we didn't bring everything. Look, we got rid of a ton of stuff. A couple of pieces of furniture have stayed with the house. Like I said, our friend is renting our house and taking care of the cat. And so we put some stuff in storage that we didn't want to bother schlepping halfway around the world. But I had quite a bit of my knitting and sewing stuff that I'm like, it's coming with me. And so when the mover was there, the movers came to pack up everything. And I said to the girl afterwards, I said, so is that the most craft stuff you've ever packed up? And she's like, oh God, no, I've moved 70-year-olds. And I was like, okay, all right, cool. I was feeling bad that I had like 4 giant boxes of, knitting wool and fabric and a sewing machine and tools and doodads. And she's like, God, no. A lot of mountains here in North Carolina. The Blue Ridge Parkway runs through my city of Asheville. Yeah, well, my dad's family grew up in Appalachia, in Kentucky, and so I've been there. I've as a kid, we visited a couple times, and obviously I've driven from Indiana to Florida because everybody goes to Disney World once in their life, right? And so I've driven across it, but I don't really remember much of it. But yeah, I'd never been in like proper mountains like the Alps. That was, basically the glaciers. Like, it was amazing. And that cable car we took up the top of the Zugspitze, the Seilbahn, you can look it up on YouTube. It holds like 3 world records for like longest single span, height differential. It's like 2 miles, and it goes super fast, and it goes like straight up this freaking very steep mountain. Oops, hang on. See, I got excited and I just started knitting. I forgot I was ribbing. Yeah, it's. I'm really glad we did it, but sad we're not going anywhere else anytime soon. Pearl. Oh, Mumble Knives. Oh, I've got somebody else. Hi, Mumble Knives. Sounds like I've got some more Americans on. You guys are all up, either very late or very early, one or the other. The night owls. Louisiana. Oh, cool. That's nice. Well, nice to meet you, Mumble Knives. Don't know when you joined in, but just to recap, I am knitting a sweater from a designer called Susan Crawford. The book, it's from her book Evolution that literally only just got published. I actually bought it before it got published, and she did this cool thing where she sent you the PDF ahead of time while the book was still being printed. And so I've now received the book, and I've actually set the book aside because I am eventually going to gift it. I haven't even opened the book because I'm going to gift it to a friend of mine for a much belated birthday gift. Jody, it will come to you eventually, I swear to God. But I'm knitting one pattern out of it first. And so this is called Lenatus, which I believe has something to do with watermelon. Like, I think it's part of the scientific name for watermelon. I don't know why. But to show you what it looks like, it's a ferile yoke sweater. So knitted from the top down, so that's the collar. And so I've done the ferile down to the armpits. The book, you want me to link the book? Ooh, that's a good idea. Okay, I can do that. Susan Crawford, Evolution. And so she's sort of taken very traditional style garments and kind of, there's the book, and evolved them. And so inspired by the Vintage Shetland project. And so I remember seeing it on Twitter because it was interesting. There was some kerfuffle about it, like she had trouble getting it published because it was called Evolution. And so it kind of went a bit viral on Twitter. And so that's when I sort of bought it to support her, basically. But there's a couple patterns in there that I really like. I like color work. Obviously, the jumper I'm wearing, I was talking about earlier on the stream, is an 8-ply color work jumper that I did many years ago. And so there is an option to do the whole thing in the stranded color work. I've opted to just do it on the yoke, and then it'll have short sleeves as well. Oh, I do have a photo. This is when I tried it on the other day, if you want to see. I was trying it on for length. So it ended up being slightly longer. I went a little bit further than that, but that gives you an idea. And so then I've got the armhole stitches are on some waist wool. And so as soon as I get to the end of this bloody ribbing, I will be picking up the armholes and knitting short sleeves down from there. I think with color work, it just takes, it's not it's not a portable thing. You kind of have to have a dedicated time to knit. And I just find color work really addictive. And the more you do it, obviously, the better you get at it. We've talked a little bit on the previous streams I did about, doing 2-color. I did a giant sampler sweater from the Sweater Handbook with 2 colors, and where I forced myself to hold 1 color in each hand. Because normally, obviously, I'm an English style knitter. I hold the working wool in my right hand. But doing ferile, doing color work is a lot easier if you can hold the other color in your left hand and have 1 color in each. And so I forced myself to do that for an entire jumper. And that's how you get better at it really quickly. Haven't tried yet. Yeah, you should give it a go. I mean, I find ferile easier than intarsia. And I've done a bit of intarsia. I mean, I like the sort of, as we would say in Australia, daggy 80s knitting patterns, the slightly, I guess, cheesy would be the closest American equivalent, cheesy knitting, 80s picture knitting patterns, and I've done a couple of them. But intarsia I find a little bit trickier with, multiple strands hanging off different areas. Ferile, working with 2 colors is manageable. And if you pick a pattern that doesn't have long floats, that helps too. So you don't have to worry about, the stranding on the back side so much. You can do it with just one, using the right, like by dropping 1 color, picking up the other. It just takes a bit longer. Doing the 2 color will be faster. There's a video on my YouTube I should mention, each of these episodes I leave up on Twitch for 2 weeks, and then I archive them over to YouTube. So if you want to see any of the past ones, they're on my YouTube channel, which I should link. But I've got a video on YouTube about doing, showing off some different ways of doing Fair Isle, especially with, if you're knitting it in the flat. You know, Fair Isle's a lot easier in the round because all you got to do is knit. It's when you throw purling into the mix that things can get a little bit more complicated. There's my channel. There's my channel. How do I actually get you the URL for my channel? I think that URL will work. Yeah, I don't have a custom username, I don't think, on YouTube. Do I? Profile picture, banner images. Oh, I do have a custom URL. There it is. How do I not know that? No, it's a different, if it's a different URL over there, because I'm stupid and I didn't pick the same one everywhere. I mean, this one, I work for AWS, which is why my Twitch one has that, because I started using Twitch for work. We do, you know, we stream tech, we talk about tech stuff. And then I decided, oh, hey, I'll do some knitting things. So I stupidly shouldn't have kept that from my knitting and sewing, but I did. And so I've got a different identity all over the place. Yes, Australian accent. Oh, thank you. Ha, ha, ha. Yeah, I lived in Australia. I'm married an Aussie, and I've lived in Sydney for 20 years. And the Australians will be laughing because they don't think I sound Australian in the slightest. That makes them giggle. But my Americans always think I sound Australian. But no, I think once you're a grown-up, your accent doesn't change. Doesn't change very much anyway. Okay, I'm coming back around to the start of the round, so I think that's 7 rows. 2 more, and then I can cast off. Flip-flop, what do you mean flip-flop? This? Oh, you think Indiana sounds weird. Yeah, it's funny when I go home to visit. My husband laughs at me because when I'm around my southern relatives, suddenly I come out very Kentucky. And, yeah. I don't know, you'd think living with an Aussie for 20 years, it would have rubbed off more. I think our accents have just sort of slightly merged. Okay, end of that round. Move the stitch marker. Keep going. So remember, the trick to ribbing is to always move the working wool between the needles back to the side that you need it on. If you forget to do that, you will create yarn overs, you will create extra stitches, your piece will get wider, and it will have holes in it. You know, the number of times someone would come into the knitting shop with a scarf that gradually did this, and it's like, why is this happening? My ribbing is getting wider. Well, you're creating extra stitches. How many stitches do I have on the needle right now? I don't actually know. Let me look at the pattern because I could probably tell you by looking at the pattern. So I'll show this off. So this, as I said, I'm using the PDF version of the pattern, and so I've got it on the iPad. And what I do is I've actually, because obviously it's got a lot of different sizes. It does like 10 different sizes. And so I've highlighted the one I'm doing. I've highlighted the instructions that apply to me. I've crossed out the sections that don't apply to me. Very handy for keeping track of something like very complicated like this. So I am at 432 body stitches. Yeah, 432. And that's actually down because the worst was when I got to the part, I increased throughout the yoke, and then I got to the section at the armpits where I divided. That would have had the most. So how many stitches was that dividing for the arms? Because that would have been the worst. Increase, 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 increase. Divide for body and sleeves. So at the point, oh, yeah, where it is. 600. I had 600 stitches on the needle when I divided for the armholes. So 600 stitches around that final row of furlough. And it was, you don't have to count 600 at any given point, but your pattern repeats are fairly short, so you're only ever doing, groups of sort of 4 to 8 at a time, but each round, that final round of the armpit, each round took forever. So by comparison, 400 and however many, that's just zipping along. So you can see there on the armhole, if I roll it down, you can see I've left the stitches live. So I've just threaded them onto some scrap wool. So I'll pick those up on the circular needle here shortly and knit the arms down from there. How long have I been knitting? I didn't knit as a kid. I didn't. I picked it up when I moved to Australia. So I moved to Australia at the end of 2001, and I did some crafts. I made myself a patchwork quilt by hand with shirts from the Salvation Army there in Australia, because my mom did quilting all growing up, so I knew how to do that. So I made a quilt. I made a couple quilts. I got a sewing machine. I did some cross stitch. I found the local craft store and did some cross stitch. And then, so it was probably, when was my first knitting? It was when we were living at Bailey Street. So it was probably 2003 or 2004. And my mother-in-law, now mother-in-law, who's Australian, I'd said something to her about it on the phone. And so she sent me a Kids Learn to Knit book and a ball of yarn and some plastic needles. No worries, Melissa. Hope you're feeling better. And yeah, so probably 15 years. And so I started off knitting a pot holder, which is on my blog. If you go back to the very beginning of the knitting tag, I knitted a pot holder. It was right when the Harry Potter movies were first coming out, the early 2000s. And so I knitted several of the house scarves. I knitted one for me, and then my sister wanted one, and then a few friends were asking me for them, and then I did a few on commission. And those are I did them out of 8-ply in the round as a tube, stocking stitch, and each one's 6 foot long. So you get a lot of good practice on just muscle memory of knitting quickly and knitting evenly on those. So I made several of those, and that's sort of when I started, mid-2000s was when I started getting into knitting heavily. I started joining a couple Stitch and Bitch groups back in Sydney. I did a couple classes at the local knitting shop, which was then called Tapestry Craft back in Sydney. And within a year or two, I was actually fed up with my job in tech. I was burnt out. And so I quit tech entirely, and I went to the knitting shop, and I said, so are you going to hire me or what? And so I ended up working, I quit tech in 2004, I guess. Yeah, it was before we got married, so it would have been that year, 2004, and went and worked in the knitting shop for close to 4 years. So I was there. We went through the rebranding from Tapestry Craft to Morris and Sons. It was run by the Morris family in Sydney. It's a family craft store. It's been there for decades. Obviously, they started off very needlecraft heavy, but needlepoint and tapestry, it's all cyclical. And so needlepoint, tapestry, cross stitch has kind of gone through a bit of a down phase, just as they were lucky they got on the knitting, as knitting was sort of really taking off, this sort of recent wave of knitting. And so I got to help them build up the knitting shop. I taught classes. I established the Australian Knitters Group on Ravelry because I got into Ravelry fairly early when Ravelry was just being established. So I set up the Australian Knitters Group on there. Yeah, it was a great fun time. Like, I actually loved it. You know, I got to sort of help identify trends and get in some of the first lots of like Noro and Knit Picks needles and stuff into Australia that were just being introduced to the market there. I got to meet some famous people. You know, Nikki Gemmell? Yes, who's done those books of like embellishments and finishing techniques. She was in Sydney because she was doing some sort of knitters tour cruise around Australia, and so we actually had her do a book signing in the shop. That was really fun. I got to, you know, occasionally help out. The local TV news would want some knitters, you know, to knit in the background behind the Weather Girl because they were doing some charity initiative. So I was on the TV a couple times. It was super fun. I actually loved it. I mean, it was hard-ass work, standing on your feet all day long, helping the public who are not always awesome, but some people are. I taught a lot of classes. I taught socks on circulars. I taught kids knitting. So yeah, I was heavily into knitting then. And then, I mean, the only downside, to tell you the truth, the only downside is working in craft retail. You can guess the end of this story. Doesn't pay a lot. And, you know, everyone who was working there was either like had a partner supporting them, as I did, or was a student. And around 2008 was when we bought our house. And so we started looking. We found a house to buy, and the timing was such that it was like, I'm going to have to go back. Like, I didn't want to go back to tech, but knowing that in a tech job I would instantly double my take-home pay kind of made it hard to turn that down. And so reluctantly, I left the knitting shop. I mean, I'm still part of their family. I love them. If you ever go to Sydney or Melbourne, because they have shop there, or Katoomba, Morris and Sons have my heart. They're just a great family. Unfortunately, Albert, my dear friend who hired me, he passed away last year, but the shop is still going. His family are carrying it on. You know, I loved it. I absolutely loved it. And, you know, someday when I retire, that would be the dream, to go back and do something. Much as like how my mom's got her quilting shop back in Indiana. Like, that was her dream always. But tech, I instantly got I doubled my pay when I went back to being a coder. And then, you know, as I've gotten promoted over the years, I make orders of magnitude more in tech. I mean, the fact that I was able to move overseas. Like, my company have an office here. They effectively paid me to move here. It's a very big privilege. And so I'm trying to take advantage of it, you know, while I've got it, because someday I will quit and go back to doing this type of thing. And maybe by then, my live streaming knitting Twitch empire will be established, and I'll just have my knitting and sewing talk show and not have to work. Wouldn't that be great? But yeah, how long have I been knitting? That was the long way of answering that story. I've been knitting for about, I would say then, 16 years, 16 or 17 years now. Honestly, I don't do it as much as I did in those first few years. Obviously, working in the knitting shop. But, you know, in recent years, as I've been doing more clothes sewing, I've gotten more into garment sewing, so that's taken up some of my time. And the things I like knitting take a long time. Like something like this. Like I now know that knitting a 4-ply Farrell jumper, that fits my wardrobe and fits the usage that I will do, but God, it takes a long time to knit. It's a lot easier to churn out scarves and hats and socks. Or baby things. Crocheting for 3 years, cool. Cool. You know what I want to get into? Oh, and he's not here. There's this guy who's been on many of my streams so far, Woban the Wonder Dog. Woban is a weaver. Yeah, 8-ply is a light worsted mumble. 8-ply is what they call it in Australia. They use ply, even though ply technically means the number of strands twisted together, but in Australia it's how they do thickness. So 8-ply is what in the UK you'd call a double knitting, and in America would be a light worsted. But yeah, Woban the Wonder Dog has been on in my comments a few times, and is a weaver. And now we follow each other on Instagram, and oh, I'm so tempted by weaving, but you know, weaving is like you got to buy equipment, like a loom, and so. I don't know. I feel myself. But I feel like with weave, I said to him, I'm like, what do you make? Like, I know I'd make some like dish towels and table runners, but like, I don't know. I just feel like sewing and knitting and crocheting, you've just got a few more options in making utility pieces. With weaving, I feel like it would literally just be me doing it for the sake of the art, which is not a problem. Oh, Woban is here! There's Woban. Your ears were burning. I knew it. Yes. Oh, Woban with the weaving. Oh. Yeah, rugs. No. Yeah. I didn't tell you this, Woban. So the last trip we made, before Corona, my birthday back in mid-March in Australia, the weekend of the 15th, we flew from Sydney to Melbourne and then drove to Geelong, which is in rural Victoria in Australia. But Geelong has the Australian Wool Museum. And they have one of the only, I think the only, you can look them up online, the only working, what do you call it? It's the one with the punch cards. The jacquard loom. They have a working jacquard loom in Australia. This where we got the idea of using punch cards for computers, where this all came from. They have it, and so we went there literally because I wanted to see this thing in action from both a tech perspective and a textile arts perspective. And so I think I put a few photos on Instagram at the time. I actually didn't bother. I should blog that trip because it was amazing. And I stood and I harangued the little old man running the loom for quite some time. They use it. It's not the type of weaving you do. It does tufts, and so it weaves these tiny cut off little bits of fabric, and it's got these sort of bird shaped pinchers. But it was so cool. This sort of like giant belt-driven mechanical monstrosity. But yeah, it was so neat. And so that was our last trip. We flew to Geelong. We went to the Wool Museum. Then we drove out to this amazing Australian restaurant called Bray that has a bed and breakfast, and we stayed the night there. And that's literally, when we flew out to Melbourne on the Friday, and that's when I got the email that we were not going to be working out of the office starting on Monday. And by the time we flew back, people on the plane were wearing masks, and that was the last vacation in the middle of March. But yeah, I should put up, I'll share on my blog. I need to do it. I've been actually meaning to put up for 9 months now, photos of the jacquard loom, because it was so cool. But you'd need an extra wing on your house because it was this giant industrial thing. I imagine weaving is a slightly, faster return on, you get that's one of the things I like about sewing as opposed to knitting, is if you want to make a thing, it's generally faster. I imagine weaving goes faster than, I think weaving you have a longer setup. Like I saw you doing something with your weft on Instagram the other day. I feel like weaving, you probably have a lot more initial setup for a project. Although, what am I talking about? Like, I spent like an hour the other day printing and sticking together a sewing pattern. So, and then prepping the fabric and cutting out the so sewing has does have a significant setup time. And technically knitting should as well. I mean, you should be doing tension swatches and things like that, even though sometimes you don't. And then you end up, as I did with this thing, I mean, I actually had, if you go back and look at my Instagram, I had it knitted down the first few motifs down from the collar before I realized A, I'd made a mistake, and B, it was coming out too big. And so I frogged it and pulled it apart and started again. So yeah, if I'd actually done a proper setup before diving in on this project, I wouldn't have had to do that. Setup isn't too long. I take my time because it's not, I'm kneeling and it's not easy on my back. Oh yeah, I don't like the sound of that. I did teach a class last year or the year before. There's a guild, hand weavers and spinners guild, I believe, or is it hand spinners and weavers guild? I can't remember, in Australia, back in New South Wales. And they invited me to give a talk to give a version of my talk about how knitting patterns are like a programming language. Basically looking at some of the intersections between textile arts and technology. And so they invited me to give my talk at one of their meetings. And so I know many of the people in the guild, but I'd never been along. And so I went along to their meeting, and people were showing off many of their pieces. And that's really when I caught the weaving bug, because I saw some really gorgeous small projects. Yeah. See, not having room for it. That was my worry. I figured that a loom, I thought the looms were fairly big, but I'm seeing now that you can get these smaller ones. I mean, look, I did a sort of a weaving as a kid. I did those, pot holders where you weave the cut off, rings of jersey and make pot holders. I've made dozens of those as a kid. That's the only actual weaving that I've done. So that's a temptation. The weaving is a temptation, the getting a loom. The other one I have looked into as well is, and it's sort of related, but into machine knitting. And I think there are people who get into machine knitting because they want to just crank out, a sweater, a stocking stitch sweater in as little time as possible. But I kind of want to get into it more on the hacking side of things. So there's some people doing some really cool stuff with hacked knitting machines where you can send designs to them and manipulate them on the fly. And so I'll show you guys something really cool. Let me just grab this. So my friend Sarah Spencer back in Melbourne, and let me just link to her her website for you. Heart of Pluto, it's called. Heart of Pluto knitting. Here it is, heartofpluto.co. She and her partner have done a lot with hacked knitting machines. So that's their blog. They have a shop as well linked on there. But so she made this for us. So I went to Chicago and saw Hamilton back in 2017. And so she knitted this for us on her hacked knitting machine. And so this is, put it under the big camera as well. So yeah, so she's able to, she's hacked it into a wireless knitting printer effectively, which has involved, writing code and hooking it up to an Arduino. But also they've designed like a custom color switcher so that she can do 3 colors in a row because normally you can only do 2. And it's just amazing. I saw for Christmas she was doing commissions on custom stockings for people, doing personalized stockings for people. She's done baby blankets and things for people. But yeah, so I've been keeping my eye out. So there's a couple specific machine knitting models that I believe are easier to hack than others. So there's one called like an electro knit or something like that. But again, they take up a fair amount of room too. So it's even money whether I will get into the machine knitting hacking or the weaving first, to be honest with you. Have we got a centimeter yet? Here I am coming up to the stitch marker. Let's look at this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I've done like 8. Let me actually measure it. My little needle gauge and measuring thing from the Wool Inn in Penrith in New South Wales. Oh, that's more than a centimeter. Let's cast this sucker off. Yes. Oh, you've seen the constellation knit. Yeah, so she did a map of the galaxy. Woven Saw. Yeah, that's her. Sarah is her name. She did this giant meters by meters knitted version of the galaxy, which I just think is so absolutely amazing. I love it. And she's just a really cool person. If you look her up on YouTube, you'll see some talks she's done about their stuff. And it's so good. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to start the casting off. So I'm going to get to this, to the stitch marker. And I'm going to use I'm going to switch back to a larger needle for casting off. And so the reason I do that is because a lot of people find when they cast off their garments or whatever, casting off, you tend to do a bit tighter than you knit, just the way that you cast off. And so it can lead to your garment being a bit tight. I mean, this sweater that I'm wearing, actually the cast off is a little bit tight at the neck, which means sometimes it's a little harder to pull on and off over your head. Also, this one isn't ribbing, so that makes a difference. So one trick to make your cast off a little bit looser is to actually use a bigger needle. And so I'm going to go switch back to so I was using a 2.75 for the ribbing. I'm going to switch back to I think 3.75 for the cast off. I don't think it specifies which type of cast. Let me just check the pattern. It just says, where does it say? Repeat this round until rib measures 1 centimeter. It doesn't even tell you to cast it off. I mean, you just do it. So I'm going to be casting off. Usually a pattern will say cast off in pattern. And what that means is the knits you should knit and the purls you should purl. So I'm just going to do a normal cable cast off, I believe it's called, similar to a cable cast on, where it's going to look like a little bit of like a rope along the edge. So look what I've done. I've actually taken, so that there is the circular needle I was knitting with. I've pulled it through and I'm just going to leave that lying there. Meanwhile, here I've got my big needle. And I don't even need the cable on it. I really only need the end. So I can just use that end. I don't even need the cable. So what I'm going to do, you'll remember the first 2 stitches of the row are knits. So I'm going to do a knit. I'm going to knit the second stitch as a knit. So that's the first 2. So you start a cast off by knitting 2. What's Woven saying? Yeah, you can use a crochet. You can use a crochet hook to cast off. I don't generally, but I could. What size is this crochet hook I have handy? It's a 4 millimeter. I could use that if I wanted to. I'll use the needles just because I'm demonstrating it for people. So you start a cast off by doing the first 2 stitches. And whether that's knits or purls, you follow your pattern. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the tip of the left needle to lift that stitch on the right. I'm going to lift it up. I've caught it and over the other stitch and off. and I've cast, so now I'm back to just one loop on the needle. So I've casted off one stitch. So now I just need to do that another 400 times. So this is going to take a while. So now, so that was the 2 knits. So now I need to purl. So wool comes back between the needles to the wool in front, and I'm going to purl a stitch. So I'm purling. And again, I'm going to lift. So each time now, I'm going to lift the stitch on the right over the stitch on the left and off the needle. Okay, that's my first purl. Now I'll knit another one. And wool goes to the back, and then that one goes over and off. So I'll do a few of these and then show you what it looks like. And I'm not tugging it tight deliberately like I did when I was knitting. Like I want this cast off to match the elasticity of the ribbing, you know. The first bottom up, like seamless jumper I knitted was from Jacqueline Fee's book, The Sweater Workshop, and which is based on Elizabeth Zimmerman's percentage system. And so she walks you through knitting your first seamless jumper, and you get to the end and she tells you to cast off the neck and leave a 1 meter long tail. And you're like, what? Why? And then literally the book is like, now try it on. You couldn't get it over your head, could you? Now undo your cast off and use that extra meter of yarn to cast off looser. And I was like, what? Genius, because that was exactly right. I couldn't get the damn thing over my head. And so I did exactly what she said. So yes, I am casting off. I'm thinking, I often when I cast off, it's like, think loose, because I tend to be a tight knitter at the best of times. And as I said, I am using a larger needle to do the cast off as well. So we just go around 2 knits, 2 purls. And I'll show you what it looks like. Okay, and so there we have our cast off edge. And yeah, it looks like a little bit of a chain, almost like a crochet chain along the edge. But it's nicely stretchy. That's what we're going for here. We do not want it tight. If you stretch it and it's tight, that's not good. It's gonna, you know, it's gonna rub on your waist. Actually, if it's tight, it's going to be pulling, you know, you could, God forbid, wear through it or it'll pill more. So I want it nice and loose. So that's what I'm going for here. I'm going for a nice, I mean, not loose, like I don't want it to be super loose, but I want it to be elastic is the word we're going for. Do you want me to see if I can do it with a crochet hook? Look, I'll switch to the crochet hook. And see, I'll do a few with the crochet hook because they're about the same size. So again, similar to using the knitting needle, put my wool in the front, and then see, this is a very blunt crochet hook, and it's actually kind of hard to get it in the stitches. But let me see if I do one of that. And so the thing the crochet hook makes easy is you actually can just pull that last loop through the one that's on the needle. You don't have to pick it, you know. And so that's really, and if you're doing like, I guess I would say if you weren't doing a ribbing, if you were doing just knitting or something, a crochet hook would be a lot faster. But because I'm using such fine wool, so yeah, I'll move it to the back and I'll show you that again. So I'm just going to use the hook, almost like doing a single crochet to just pull that loop through. So it can be a lot faster to use a crochet hook, especially if you're a crocheter. But I'm going to go back to using the needles because I think with this particular wool, I really need the pointiness. It's faster for me to get into the stitch with these slippery pointy addies. This is really magical, this. So I talked about Petey Cat, and then 5 minutes later, my friend texted me a picture of him. I talked about Woven. 2 minutes later, Woven appears in the chat. some sort of magical powers today. I was saying when I was sewing that ruffle sleeve top the other day, I have knitted a few ruffles. Do you want a world of pain? That's pain. Like, let's say I was doing I knitted one of the first sweaters I knitted had a ruffled edge at the bottom. And you started at the bottom, it was knitted up. And the pattern was like, cast on 800 stitches. You're like, what? And then, of course, you immediately decrease to get it down to the normal one. But, yeah, casting on hundreds and hundreds of stitches sucks. And then imagine instead, if I had done a ruffle at the bottom edge here, I would be casting off hundreds. 400's bad enough. But casting off 800 stitches would take you the better part of a day, I'm sure. Yeah, making ruffles is crazy. I'm totally crazy. Use sock weight yarn, bow carf to make a scarf. Look, I actually like knitting, I knitted with thicker wool earlier because it's instant gratification, but I think knitting out of finer weight stuff is more what I enjoy wearing. And so no, I don't. We're crazy in the sense that it takes a lot longer to make a thing, but I think the end result, it's actually worth it. I've knitted a few things in mohair. Mohair, I find the fuzziness I'm not a huge fan of. I prefer a very sort of smooth single type yarn, but it looks nice. Mohair looks nice, and you can knit sort of lacier things and it will, hold its shape. Really cool. Yeah, I don't know. I've tried a little bit of everything in my knitting career. I think where I've decided my preference is I like color work. I do like color work, and I like cables. So I've done quite a bit of cables as well. I think they both scratch the same sort of itch of, like, as I said, executing, like almost like executing a computer program. You have this complicated set of instructions, and you're executing them. And I find that a little bit more interesting than acres and acres of plain knitting. I did that. Like I said, I made those Harry Potter scarves. That is just acres and acres of plain knitting. And the thrill of just knitting wears off. But you need a project like that you can carry around, Everybody needs a portable project. And so plain knitting is great for that. Or crochet. Although crochet, usually making bigger things with crochet, so it can be harder to cart around. Amigurumi, super portable. Have you seen the jacquard laddering for color work? What do you mean by that? Send me a link for that, Woban. What are you talking about? Is that like doing slipped stitches where you're not really doing color work, but you're only ever working with one color at a time, but it makes it look like you're doing two colors in a row? Because I've done a few like that. Often called mosaic knitting or slip stitch. And it's a way of getting an effect similar to doing Fair Isle. But it's easier in that you're only ever using one color at a time. It's a technique to catch the floats. Oh, yes. So I'm a big fan of that. So if you look at my YouTube, there's a video I've done for knitting two-handed Fair Isle in the flat to show you how I do it on the purl side. Because I knitted a jumper for my husband several years ago, which was like a 1920s, 30s men's vest with a checkerboard pattern on the front, like a sort of argyle pattern on the front, but the back was plain. So I couldn't knit it in the round. I had to knit it as flat pieces, and which meant I had to do color work on the purl side, going back and forth. And it had some really long floats. And so there are techniques you do to weave the floats. I tend to weave any float 5 stitches and higher. And what we mean by that, for those of you who don't know, is if you look at the back side of this knitting, the color that you're not knitting with, you strand along or you float it across the back. And so you end up with these sort of loops. And you really don't want to do that for more than a couple stitches. One, it gets hard to keep the tension even across the front of the garment. And two, you can, when you're putting it on, you don't want to catch a finger in one of those loops. And so you need to catch the floats. You need to sort of tack them down any float that's more than 5 stitches. And so there are a couple long floats on this thing. I'm trying to see if there's an example. Like I think when I was doing this sort of snowflakey one, like there are a couple places in there where I'm doing a fairly long float. And so there are techniques to catch. And so catch it with the other yarn. And there's a way you do it on the knit side for both the working yarn and the contrast color, and there's a way you do it on the purl side. So there's sort of 4 different techniques you do, and so I demonstrate them in that video on my YouTube channel under the knitting playlist. And yeah, again, that's a technique I learned when I was doing that sampler sweater, the Janetta Dexter sampler sweater from the Sweater Workshop by Jacqueline Fee. And it's a hard one for me because it's ingrained. I just have the muscle memory of doing it. And so that's why I did the video, to sort of force myself to try and explain what I was doing, because now I just do it automatically. But it's a very, very useful technique. Oh, thanks, Mumble Knives. This is actually, look, normally I just do 1 a week. I should say this stream, I do it Sunday mornings Munich time. So Sunday morning, 10 a.m. Munich time. Unfortunately, that is a crappy time for you guys. Like that's, subtract 2.5 hours from now. That's the time that I would be starting for you on Sunday mornings here, which would be your Saturday night, I guess. And then sometimes I do a Sunday night one, which is better for the Americans. But I normally just do 1 a week. Yeah, you can just watch it after. But because I've been on vacation, holiday, Urlaub auf Deutsch, I've been doing more impromptu over the last week. And yeah, started the sewing because I thought, why the hell not? I can actually just turn everything around and point it at my sewing machine, and that worked out pretty well. I'm pleased with that. I had my mom. My mom turned up on the Twitch stream when I was sewing the other day. Was giving me advice. Oh. So just always pulling 1 stitch over and then adding 1 more on. And then taking the right hand stitch over the left hand stitch. And I'm maintaining that knit purl pattern as established. This is the longest knitting stream I've done. Sewing I did for a couple hours at a time, but this is the longest I've done on the knitting. Because we've been having such a good chat, and because I really want to get this body cast off. So for those of you who missed it earlier in the stream, I talked about the jumper that I'm wearing, which is an 8-ply Fair Isle that I did many years ago. It was an interweave pattern called Road to Golden. So I'll show you what it looks like. So this is what it looks like on me. That's what it looks like when I knitted it. But this is the pattern photo that I sort of fell in love with. which is, I fell in love with the Fair Isle part of it. Like, I don't like that particular neckline. I don't like a really wide boat neckline, not in the least, because your bra straps end up hanging out. But given that it's done in 8-ply or light worsted for the Americans or DK for the British, it knits up very quickly. And yeah, you, for the most part, only ever have 2 colors in a row. There are a few bits under the arms. There's an underarm gusset, interesting underarm gusset, where I remember there's a couple rows where you have 3 colors in a row, and I was like, why needlessly complicate things? So when I did my version, obviously I had to use a different wool. I couldn't find that exact wool, so my colors changed. But I did a different neckline at the top. Instead of just doing a raglan into a boat neck, I did a sort of modified saddle shoulder to build it up. If you go to my Ravelry page and look up Road to Golden, I'll put that in the chat. I have some notes about my modifications because I modified it fairly extensively. Where is it? Golden. And obviously this link will only work. Actually, no, I can make it public. I can change the, make the project page public. There we go. So here is the Ravelry page, which has the details of the yarn I used. I used Filatura de Croce's Zara and some more photos, and talked quite a bit about the changes that I made. Oh, here we go. But yeah, 8-ply and Fair Isle, I mean, it goes faster than this, one, but it's really warm. So I did not get a lot of wear out of it in Australia. It gets cold in Sydney, but it doesn't snow. Like, I mean, in terms of Celsius, 40s at worst, 50s in the middle of winter. Remember, if you forget if you're on a knit or purl, you just have to look very closely at the next stitch on the needle. And obviously in ribbing, you get an additional help once you've done a few rows of ribbing, because you can tell if you're on a raised up bit or a background bit. The background bits are the purls and the raised up bits are the knits. But you can also look for that little bump at the bottom of the stitch on the needle. That tells me that I'm ready to do a purl. Oh, okay, you've got a double knitting technique for the floats. I will have a look at that. Thanks. Yeah, double knitting is interesting. I started a double knitted cowl earlier this year. It's called the mustache cowl. It's this kind of cool, cowl is like a joined up scarf around your neck. And it has mustaches on it, so you can sort of pull it over your face and have a funny mustache. And it's done with double knitting. And so I started that, and I didn't like the yarn I was using for it, so I pulled it apart. But double knitting is an interesting technique. It is, you're right, it's a sort of a color work in that you're using 2 colors at a time, but you're actually knitting a double layered fabric with 1 color on each side. And yeah, I like double knitting a lot. I have not done much with it. No, not 2 strands. So actually that Hamilton blanket is a good example of double knitting. Let me grab it. Because it's knitted, like if you look at this, there's the front of it. Look at the back. The back has a different pattern on it. So it's actually 2 layers sandwiched together, but you knit them at the same time. So it's often used, I see a lot of baby blankets and stuff knitted. Yeah, how in the world does that work? Exactly. I mean, the machine knitted one is obviously more complicated. She's done some computerized stuff to make that happen. But imagine if I'm knitting along with my two colors. I'm going to knit, let's say, 3 stitches in blue, and then I'm going to knit 3 stitches in white. Well, rather than stranding along behind it, I knit my 3 in blue, which is the front piece. Then I'm going to knit my 3 in white, which is the back piece, but I don't strand. You need to look it up. I've done it. I cannot describe it right now. But yeah, double knitting is a technique where you end up with 2 layers of knitting that you knit at the same time, and they're kind of stuck together. But yeah, it's double knitting in the round for that cowl. Getting that set up was a nightmare, to knit it as a tube in the round. And I got it going, and then I ended up frogging it. Just because the colors I was doing didn't have the contrast I wanted for the mustaches. Yeah, one of the cool things is it is a way of doing, I guess, intarsia in the round, because you can do picture knitting. And the problem with doing, picture knitting in the round is you get past a section of color and then the wool is hanging there, and then when you get back around to it, it's not in the place that you need. And so it ends up being in the place, because with double knitting, you come back, you can do it in the round, but because you're then using that color on the other side, it ends up traveling all the way around and back to where you need it again. Ugh. Some of this is hard to wrap your head around unless you're actually doing it. I've not knitted a lot of Isolde's stuff. I'm familiar with Isolde Teague. I've not knitted a lot of Isolde's stuff. But there are some people who really sort of push the boundaries of techniques. I've knitted some socks by Cookie A, and dear God, if you want to really challenge yourself with socks, like Cookie A has you do some stuff that, honestly, I think she just does as a challenge for the hell of it, to prove that it can be done, not that you need to do it. There's a book, Sock Innovation by Cookie A. I have done several. I didn't bring it, did I? No, didn't bring it. I only brought a small selection of the knitting books with me. Yeah, the cool thing with double knitting is you end up with the mirror image of the pattern. You end up with the reverse of the pattern on the other side in most of the patterns. Unlike that Hamilton blanket, which has a different pattern on the back side. Normally you end up with, on the front side you have, let's say, a square of white in the middle of a sea of blue. Well, on the other side you'd have a background of white with a blue square in the middle. It's literally the reverse. And you're saying, Woben, that you use that technique to do the floats. Interesting. Because yeah, doing the double knitting, you have to make sure you keep the yarns in the right orientation for doing the double knitting. I actually had a friend 3D print me a knitting thimble. I don't know if people have seen that. I ended up not using it because it was more trouble than it's worth. But it's this plastic device that you wear on your finger that you actually run the different colors of wool through. And it sort of keeps them in the same order every time. But I ended up giving up on it and just doing the one color in each hand. For me, that's easier. And I just make a point of always having the same color in the same hand, which keeps the orientation correct. Useful for intarsia or larger motifs and color grade larger chunks of color. Yeah, it would be. Oops, slipped out. Yeah, I've done some intarsia, but I've done it the traditional style where you just break. You have different. Each section has its own ball of wool or long strand. Do you have the stranding problem when you're weaving, Woban? Because I imagine that there are certain, patterns of weaving where you might have a long float where a thread doesn't get caught by any others. You would do that for effect, basically, While you're thinking of that, Mumble Knives is asking me, do you use, for doing the sort of smaller stuff. I'm a big fan of using 2 circulars. You can do magic loops. Look, I have DPNs. I have used DPNs. I know people who swear by DPNs. DPNs annoy the crap out of me, so I don't bother with DPNs anymore. I buy circulars. I buy generally 60 centimeter circulars. What is 60? Alexa, what's 60 centimeters in inches?
60 centimeters is about 24 inches.
So that's a 24-inch circular. So yeah, I generally buy 24-inch circulars, 60 centimeter circulars, and I will use, rather than using magic loop, I can do magic loop. If I'm doing magic loop, I'll buy the 80 centimeters, which are a bit longer. But I like the 60s because there was a book by Kat Bordy who actually just, I believe, passed away here recently. But Kat Bordy had a book called Socks on 2 Circulars, which I found, and it was not the person who invented the technique, one of the people who popularized the technique, but it's a way of knitting 2 socks at the same time on 2 sets of circulars. And so when I do knit smaller things, I will often use the 2 circulars technique. I did earlier in my career buy some of those super short circulars. Like I actually have a couple Addy circulars that are literally the circumference of a sock, and they have these tiny little bent needle tips. And they're honestly, it felt like doing like miniature knitting, like you're doing this, and it's just not worth it. I like the 60 centimeter length. The 24-inch length is my favorite because I twisted that one. Because it stays out of your way. Like it's long enough that the ends hang down out of your way, but not so long that the cable wants to curl up on you. So yeah, look it up. Look up 2 circulars. And it's actually, I'm planning on doing the sleeves that way. So if you come back on Sunday, you'll see I should have the sleeves doing by then. We'll see. I'll either use 2 circulars or I'll use 180 and do magic loop for doing both sleeves at the same time. Most patterns tend to be designed to avoid that. Oh, okay. Talking about weaving and the long floats. Yeah, I mean, isn't that... I'm thinking of like, there's certain fabrics, like sateen or something like that, where you actually do, like it's a feature of it that you have really long areas of a flat thread floats on it. I'm sure it's a decorative element, but yeah. So most weaving patterns are designed to avoid that issue. The very small circulars. Yeah, I bought a couple of the Addies, but they're more for a novelty factor than anything. I don't think anyone who's serious about knitting socks would, I don't know, maybe there are people who do it. I just found it was, like knitting with just your little fingers. I think we're past the halfway point on this casting off. The world's longest. No, it's not the world's longest casting off. I have friends who knit like Shetland lace shawls and stuff, and then you're casting off like 1,000 stitches in lace weight. I mean, there's a reason I don't do that. I ordered some tiny ones because DPNs were stressing me out. Look, see how you go. Let me grab them. They're over here in the box. One sec. I guess we can discuss how people store their circulars, because this is a solution I have landed on after much trial and error. Is I use Ziploc bags and I write the size of the needles on them. And so, which size do I have? It's probably like a 2.75. That's most of my socks I knit on a 2.75. Patterns tend to be written for I think 2.25, but I am a tight knitter, so I tend to do a smaller needle. Where are you? Here it is. Oh no, they're 3.25. Is that the ones? Yeah, 3.25 are my short Addy. So there it is. That is a circular needle. That is a 3.25 circular. And look, I can't even get my whole fingers around it. Like you have to end up having to use, as Woban said, just the tips of your fingers. So you can knit a sleeve or a sock on that. But the needles have to be bent in order to make the circle. And I just found it really awkward. But see how you go. I nowadays go with the 2 circulars method. And if you've done magic loop, you understand how the 2 circulars work. It's just instead of pulling out that loop halfway through, you have 50% of the stitches on one circular needle, 50% on the other circular needle. And so each side you're effectively flat knitting. Like you pull the needles through, you knit across that side, and then you drop that entire needle, flip it around on the other side, and then go on that needle. So it's pretty easy. Mumble Nut. As for making mittens, mine are Chiagu. Oh, I don't know that brand. Oh, interesting. And Addy Flex Flips. I'm going to have to look that up as well. Oh, wow, there's clearly been some innovation in the world of... Hang on, what am I doing? Was that a knit or a purl? That was a knit. Okay. Yeah, innovation in knitting needles since the last time. Look, once you have a couple sets, you've built it up. You don't really need to buy more. So I haven't been looking at what's been coming out in terms of needles. Chiagus, they have the best cables. I am gonna look these up because not familiar with these. But I'm in Germany, I'm in Deutschland, I'm in the land of the Addies. So I feel like I should stock up on Addies while I'm here. Oh my gosh, we've been going for more than 2 hours, you guys. Wow. But I do oh, you never heard of Addies before tonight? Yeah, Addy. Well, the original one was called an Addy Turbo. I don't think they make the turbos anymore. I think that's what this needle was an Addy. Or no, is that a knit pick? Yeah, no, that's not an Addy. Addies have they had silver cables, didn't they? Gray. Yeah, well, those little ones. That's an Addy Turbo. So they had sort of a goldeny kind of a cable. Don't pull out that stitch. And the idea, I guess they were called turbos. You know, the idea was that you could knit really fast with them. So that's an Addy. That's a 40 centimeter Addy Turbo. You know, quite slick. They've got good cables. They have print. I don't know if you can see it. There's printing on the cable. But yeah, those are the Addy Turbos. And so they were the first. I feel like they were kind of, you know, before Knit Picks or Knit Pro were kind of before those got big. the Addies were ones that I think early 2000s got famous. I mean, I remember hearing about them. If any of you listened to, there was a knitting podcast. I don't even know if it's still going, but there's a knitting podcast, early knitting podcast, long time ago called Cast On with Brenda Dane, which was one of the first knitting podcasts. And I remember, I think that's where I learned about knitting turbos. She had this cool sound effect whenever she would mention Addie turbos. She'd go, she had like this lightning zap kind of a sound effect. And so I deliberately sought them out after that. And then my interchangeables are the interchangeable ones that I have. These ones, these are Addie clicks. So they're Addies as well, but they're obviously the interchangeable ones. And now they've got all different, like I looked up their website the other day and they've got heaps of different styles. We live in a time of an embarrassment of knitting tool riches, my friends. Oh, knitting podcasts? Are you kidding, Mumble Knives? There have been so many knitting podcasts. Cast On said mid 2000s was one of the first, and so yeah, Cast On it was called. It was a knitting podcast. There was one for a while. I'm not sure. I don't know if he's still doing it either, but there was one by an Aussie gentleman, a friend of mine, David Reedy, who lives in the Blue Mountains outside of Sydney. He had a knitting podcast for a while. I'm sure there are more these days. It was like during this sort of first renaissance of podcasting, and then it kind of went dormant for a while, and now we're in the golden age. But I'm sure there are knitting podcasts now. But I remember like Brenda Dane's Cast On was where, it was when I was really into knitting, and she would cause things to go viral before we kind of had that concept. Like I remember through her, I think she helped it was around the same time as Nitty.com. So if you haven't been to Nitty was one of the first online knitting magazines with free patterns. So Nitty.com. And so between Nitty and Cast On, I just remember that's when the Clapote sort of went viral, and I think most of the knitters I knew at the time had made one or did make one. There was a hoodie that I made, the Rogue hoodie, which was a cabled sort of Celtic style knitted hoodie, was also super popularized by Cast On. I remember quite a lot of us did it. But yeah, the good old days. But I'm not as much in the scene now as I used to be. It was fun working in a knitting shop because then you could, spending all day on Ravelry was plausibly part of your job. Yeah, I guess a knitting podcast sounds weird, but I mean, look, it's about the same level of weirdness as knitting on a Twitch stream. I actually tried this last year. I'll tell you, truthfully, I tried knitting on Twitch. I had someone challenged me to it last year, and this was when I was living in Sydney. And so I kind of set up my iPhone, pointed over my shoulder at what I was doing, or I don't know, I might have even had my husband pointed at it. It was blurry. You couldn't see what I was doing. I don't think anyone watched it. I only did it like once. It was a huge waste. And so, a couple months back, David's last podcast, 2012. Yeah, he was doing it for a long time, David was. What was it? Sticks and String. That's what David calls his, Sticks and String. But if you go back and listen to past episodes of Sticks and String, but yeah, so I tried the Twitch knitting and then kind of let it lapse. And then my job now, so I work for Amazon Web Services and I'm part of the developer relations team. And so we do a lot of speaking at tech conferences and going and talking at tech meetups. And of course, this year, all of that has moved online because nobody's meeting up in person anymore. So we've been doing a lot of Twitch streaming. And so I've had to get up to speed with how some of my colleagues are really good at it. You know, they're producing very slick Twitch shows about coding. And so I had to get a webcam and I had to get lights and I had to figure out how some of this worked. And I was talking to one of my colleagues, Martin Beebe, a month or two ago. And we were talking because Martin's hobby is music and he was talking about streaming himself playing guitar. And I was like, well, that's nice. You know, streaming I can't really stream myself knitting, And he's like, why not? And he sort of challenged me and he gave me an idea because I have a fancy microphone that I use when I'm streaming, which has this arm that sticks out over my desk. And he's like, you could mount your iPhone on that and it can point down at what your hands are doing. And I was like, that is genius. And so I gave it a go. And I actually blogged. If you want to see what it looks like, by the way, right now, from my perspective, let me just give you a link to my blog. I blogged this just like a few days back. I had my husband take a picture of me so you can see what my setup looks like. Here it is. There. So if you want to see what it looks like from my perspective, that'll show you what I'm doing. And you can see the armature that sticks out it means I can't use my fancy microphone because I'm using the stand to hold my iPhone up. But it works. I'm surprised it works really well. Like you can see what my hands are doing. I use this software called OBS to stitch together the two camera feeds, and each time I sort of set up some different scenes with photos so that I can switch and show you photos of whatever jumper I'm wearing and things like that. But yeah, if you're curious. And so I decided to do it because Martin sort of said, and I was like, yeah, all right, let's do it. Why not? I will produce the most boring Twitch stream in the history of the world. And then to my surprise, people have been watching, a few people at a time, which is really cool. And I thought I would feel awkward sitting and talking to myself for an hour. I thought would be super challenging, but instead it actually flies by. And I think a big part of it is, as you said, Mumble, I miss my knitting circle. I miss being around people. And this is kind of substituting for me. And so then I expanded to spinning it around and doing it for the sewing because my sewing table is just on the other side of this desk. And that worked pretty well. Because otherwise, as an extrovert, I am going a bit mad. Crafting streams are relaxing and informative. Yeah, so there's someone who follows me. I don't think he's on here, but Hut Armories is a really cool, I just discovered because he was on my stream and then I followed him back, which does like blacksmithing. And I find his really interesting. He plays chill music and you just see him going along. I found your stream because Mike Sharp. You know Sharpie, Woban. Oh, Sharpie is a mate from back in Sydney. Mike Sharp. Yeah, he's a friend of mine. A great local member of the Sydney tech community. His hobby is beekeeping. I would love to see Sharpie doing a Twitch stream about beekeeping one of these days. But yeah, I'm just very pleased that you all have managed to find me. And yeah, I feel like if I had music, I wouldn't feel the need to talk so much. And Hut Armories has sort of cool, chill music on his. So that's I want to look and see how he does his and try and copy however he's doing it. Oh, through Atlassian. Oh, okay, yeah. I have heaps of... I interviewed there many years ago. Didn't get it. But, yeah, heaps of ex-Atlassian and current Atlassian folks in Sydney. Sydney's like, their headquarters, really. I always say the overlap of people who are in the tech industry and who do fibercraft and textiles is a lot more than the non-crafters realize. They think that they think only grandmas knit, which is also sexist because that assumes that they think grandmas don't know their way around technology. Whereas my mother was a sysadmin for many years and now runs a quilting shop. They think that. I had actually my only tweet that has ever gone seriously viral was a spew several years ago. I had a spew about the maker movement. It was some thread. It was some discussion. It was the discussion when Naomi Wu was having a fight with Maker magazine because they said she was a fake geek girl or something like that, or I don't know. And I had some tweet, and it was a bit of a rant, and it was basically like some guy was saying that of course the maker movement is 80% male because only dudes care about like electronics and 3D printing and stuff. And I was like, that is such nonsense. The only reason you think the maker movement is male is because you are discounting the millions of women who are doing knitting and sewing and crocheting. But those are old-fashioned and grandma things, so they don't count as part of the maker movement, right? And it touched a nerve. I had like 30,000 retweets or something like that, and it, every now and then it crops up again. Somebody discovers it and retweets it. But it just really pissed me off, this idea that because someone started publishing a magazine called Make Magazine, and everything in it has a plug and is electronic, it's like suddenly Silicon Valley bros discovered crafting, but they can't call it. I actually went to a lecture. It was when I happened to be in Singapore a few years ago, and there was a lecture by Dale Doherty, who founded Make Magazine. And I actually raised my hand and I said, why didn't you call it craft? Like, why did we need a special cool new name for making stuff? Because people were already doing that. Like, I'm a crafter. And he was like, I definitely think knitting and weaving and sewing are part of the maker movement. Oh, they're definitely part of the maker movement. And it's like, no. I'm not asking for permission to be in your special people club. I want to know why you didn't want to be in mine. Why mine wasn't cool enough. And it's that thing where, when women do it, it's undervalued. And a woman is a cook, but a man is a chef. Well, I'm a crafter. But if I'm a maker, if I bought a fancy machine that does it, which is nonsense. Yeah, here you Woban's laughing at me because I get very, it just annoys the shit out of me. It really does. That, how you could look at something like this thing that I'm making and think it was any less complex than setting up a 3D printer and crapping out some design you saw on that you downloaded off a website, please. And they have to reinvent it, but more shoddily. Exactly, woman. That's when I would do this talk about knitting and textiles and computer programming, and all these tech bros would be like, wait, so when you're doing a sweater, you have to keep all those numbers in your head? No shit. And your grandma was doing this a long time. I'm swearing now, and I shouldn't be. And your grandma was doing this there's people doing this in their head, and it's massively complicated stuff that for a long time people have just because women did it, and older women, and because it didn't involve anything electronic, was seen as being inherently less cool, less technical. My rant for the day. Yeah. I think the magazine folded, didn't it? Or is it still going? I can't remember. But yeah, I was just so livid about that. It's like, oh no, we definitely consider, textile arts to be part of the maker movement. We existed first. You should be asking for my permission to be part of the crafting movement. buddy. I guess you can't, trademark something that's existed for thousands of years. Oh, the end is in sight. Look, that's all that's left. And then I'm probably going to break for lunch. So if you want to be notified when I'm streaming, please hit the subscribe button, I guess, and then you will get a notification, or follow me on Twitter. I send out a tweet when I'm going live. I'll probably do some more over the coming days before Sunday, just because I can. Once I'm back at work and I'm sitting in front of this computer 8 hours a day, it becomes a lot less attractive. Although, if I'm streaming with you, I can't be watching The Mandalorian at the same time. Decisions. 1 hour till 2021. Oh, you're in Australia, Woban. Did I know that? I'm not sure I knew that. Makes sense now. Duh. Makes sense how you know Sharpie and Atlassian people now. Yeah, I've been following along because, Sydney is currently going through a COVID outbreak. After having no cases for weeks and weeks and weeks, it's now exploded. Oh, you're in New Zealand. Ah, Kiwi, I see. Oh, all right, you're here first. Yeah, unfortunately, Australia... I was saying earlier, we were talking about whether we regretted coming, and for a while there, when Australia was pretty much COVID-free and Germany's exploding, I was feeling really bad. But now Australia are back in the same boat and are heading towards that direction. So it doesn't really make a difference where you are if you can't do anything fun, right? And I'd much rather be in lockdown in winter than in summer, to be honest with you. I don't feel bad about staying in my house all the time. Oh, you're in Sydney, Woban. Oh. COVID-19 near me. Yeah, I was reading a little bit about that. I mean, honestly, the COVID app in Germany is so good. Like, it uses the Apple and the Google APIs, tells you when you've had contacts near anyone. Like, it works when the screen's off and everything. All the problems that the one in Australia, it doesn't have those issues. Yeah, Mumble, it's just so bad in America right now. I mean, my sister's family are in LA, and I was just reading this morning, like, LA's in crisis, California's in crisis. Indiana, where the rest of my family are from, was like one of the top states. It spread like wildfire through the Amish community earlier this year, which there's a significant Amish population around where my family live. So my aunts had it, my mother's had it, my stepfather's had it, quite a few people. My brother and his family had it quite early. Actually, though, the one sort of bright spot here is my sister-in-law has just been vaccinated. She's a nurse, and so she was, at one of the top of the lists. So very happy to see that's happening, and I'm hopeful that my 2 living grandmothers will be able to get the vaccination soon. They should, they're older. They should be hopefully up there. Whether it's a question of whether people get it is another question. Germany is just starting. I literally saw an ad on Facebook this morning. Germany are just ramping up now that the EU's approved the vaccines. Angela's setting up like 400 immunization centers across the state. I was just looking at the website. We're starting, of course, with the healthcare, essential healthcare workers, people in nursing homes, people with chronic conditions, all of that. So I imagine I'll be fairly down the list, but Angela doesn't mess around. Germany are very efficient when it comes to this stuff. So I'm hopeful that we'll be able to be vaccinated within the next 6 months. Looking at the discussion here, talking about, keeps track of the contact tracing. Oh my gosh, you went to New Orleans after Mardi Gras, Mumble? Why? It's like my parents, my mom and my stepfather went to Vegas a few months back. I was like, why? I don't understand. I mean, I'm very fortunate in that I can do my job from home. This is 9 months now. My husband and I have both been working from home. It's a privilege to not have to go out. And I think if you can stay home, you should stay home and knit or weave or sew or crochet. It was like a few days after. Oh, right, because Mardi Gras would have been beginning of the year, wouldn't it? So it would have been very early. Yeah. I mean, I was in Chicago in January, as I said, for this work conference, and it was honestly like there was talk of like, I think, Wuhan, like there might have been some word about the first few cases or something. Because I remember I after the conference, I stayed for a week in Indiana to visit my family. And my Korean grandmother insisted on giving me a mask to wear on the flight back to Australia. And I didn't, of course. It was like end of January. Nobody knew what the hell, like nobody thought there was cause for that. And then I remember getting back to work in February in Sydney, and one of my colleagues was from, her family were from Wuhan, and she'd gone home for Christmas, and they had shut, they basically locked the city down, and so she was stuck there. And so I was talking to her manager, my colleague, about like, because then when she was able to get back to Australia, she had to like go into quarantine in like Darwin or something like that for a few weeks. And so I think I was sort of aware of it fairly early on in February, but it all seemed like something happening very far off. And then, end of February, early March was when I told my manager and my boss's boss that we were looking to go overseas. And, they were very sad about it. And I remember, he brought up, well, Kris, what happens, this pandemic, you're not going to be going anywhere. And I was like, are you kidding? We're not going to get our visas and everything sorted until middle of the year, June or July. And I'm sure it'll all be over by then. That's what I said back in February, March. Versus now we'll be lucky if it's back to normal by June or July this year. Last few stitches to cast off, folks. This is historic. Just see if my husband's yelling at me to go to lunch yet. Not yet. Okay. I feel like this is actually, finishing the sweater right at the end of the year. Well, I would have liked to have finished it. I've still got the sleeves to do, and I don't think I'm going to finish the sleeves in the next 11 hours. So it won't quite be done, but maybe I don't know. Maybe I'll finish them tomorrow. Like, isn't that the thing? You know, the way you start the year is meant to set the tone for the rest of the year. There's all these superstitions about it. So one of the things I've done the last few years, and I'm actually doing tomorrow, is and who was it from Louisiana? Was that Mumble? Like Hoppin' John, right? Hoppin' John is like this traditional Southern dish of black-eyed peas and sort of salt pork and greens. And it's a very traditional thing. It's one of those foods that's a superstitious food to have for New Year's. And part of the reason is, you know, anything with beans or corn or little things, they're like coins. And so it's a sort of superstition that it will bring you money and good fortune in the new year. So I usually make Hoppin' John on New Year's Day. So I managed to find black-eyed peas yesterday in Germany. Or no, you've never heard of it? Maybe it's more of an Appalachian thing. I might have gotten it from Appalachian recipes. It's black-eyed peas, basically. Schwarzaugenbohnen auf Deutsch. Black-eyed beans. They call them here Schwarzaugenbohnen. I found them yesterday in Germany and paid like $4 for a pound of beans. But I'm going to be making that tomorrow. But yeah, starting with greens, because greens